In this class we're going to look at the research proposal. Now let's start by looking at the purpose of the research proposal. First of all, outline research questions and analyze their importance in given sets of circumstances. So it's important to identify the research questions, what exactly is required, what's needed, and rank the questions in order of their importance, and then set about finding solutions to the questions in the order in which they've been set out. So for example, a company may have several issues it needs to look into. So there are several research questions, several areas to be investigated. Prioritize and set about finding answers to those. It's important to review the associated literature and present the current state of knowledge in the area. The literature, past literature, is a good source of ideas for how to solve the research question. And it'll also have looked at research techniques in the past and perhaps have discarded some, have rejected some because of some problems, some issues. So past research is a good way of finding out what methodology should be used in the research. And it's always possible, I suppose, to learn from the past. It's possible to gain an insight from past experience, which is very valuable and can shorten the whole procedure, can shorten the work. Discuss a methodology and data sources that will enable the research to further our understanding of the area. It's important to identify how the research will be conducted. What's the nature of the problem and what's the best approach to getting an insight on the problem. If it's a marketing-based issue looking at customer needs, it may be by survey or by questionnaire, by focus groups, or by one of those techniques. And these are all covered in other videos in this module. And it's important that you have a look at those and prepare your notes from them. But in the context of the present discussion, it's just important to understand how to approach the problem. What is the best technique? And that also casts back to the second point here. Look at past research in the area, because it's a good indicator of the most appropriate approach to analysing the problems. It's clear that research must be funded. Research just can't take place in a vacuum. Research is expensive and requires to be properly funded. So it requires resources, time, materials, travel, computer facilities, expert knowledge. Research, generally speaking, is expensive, and they require funding. Research in the corporate area is usually funded out of a research and development budget. Companies normally have set aside some resources in their budgeting process to cover research costs. Academic research, by contrast, is usually funded by some commissioning agencies, commissioned by the government or commissioned by local authorities, local governments, or commissioned by the universities themselves or by colleges. So academic research is normally funded out of more public money. Journalistic research is conducted in the anticipation of getting some insight into an issue that will be useful for publishing and will therefore increase circulation and sales. So journalistic research is very similar to investment expenditure. It's done in anticipation of a future return. Mind you could say the same about corporate research that's undertaken in order to solve a problem, which will also increase the return on the assets as well. So it's very similar to investment expenditure also. Now, the benefits of research to the researcher. Well, the researcher has freedom to devise the plan and research. The researcher normally is the person who comes up with how the research should be conducted, why certain issues are important, and what approaches should be adopted in trying to get an insight into the research. The researcher must usually negotiate a budget for this. The researcher needs to be funded, and also the general research needs to be funded. But the researcher needs an income. The researcher needs to have a salary or some sort of reward for the activity, and also the expenses of the research must be covered. So generally the researcher will negotiate the budget. The activity forces discipline on the researcher to adhere to agreed guidelines unless otherwise allowed. This is particularly important in the case of time and resource constraints. So the researcher must abide by the time scale, for example. When will the research be completed? When will the findings be made known? It can't be open-ended. It can't just go on and on forever. There has to be a finish date, and the finish date has to be agreed and signed off and adhered to. And it's the researcher who has responsibility to honour that agreement. Now, the types of research proposals. Well, first of all, there's the internal. Business organizations may need research into various internal activities. For example, the effectiveness of the stock control system, or the optimum use of office space, or something on the production line, something to do with the flow of production through the various departments, or logistics, or whatever. So business organization may require research, and the proposal may be aimed at that. Or it could be external. Research institutes and think tanks and universities tend to focus on issues outside of their own organizations. A lot of university work, for example, is aimed at more academic type research, trying to find out fundamental relationships in society or in business or in the natural sciences or whatever. So those tend to be aimed at the outside. Now, the complexity of the proposal. Well, there are 3 levels of complexity. First of all, early ideas. These are simply the exploratory ideas that are brought up at the start, ideas to suggest that the research may be a good idea and why the research is a good idea, just very basic ideas at the very start. They usually involve a small team to discuss the importance of the proposal and its feasibility. Generally speaking, when an idea for research is first mooted, then a small team will talk about it and discuss it and try to brainstorm what would be good about it and what's bad about it and what issues will arise and what problems and how much will it cost and so on. So very early days, early types of ideas. It could be small scale study. A research team can vary enormously in size. So a research team could be many people engaged in a very sophisticated piece of research, or it could be a small team of a couple of people, 2, 3 people, looking at a particular topic. Often research is conducted by one person who has the responsibility of researching the idea and bringing in some sort of conclusion and some sort of set of recommendations. It's usually a straightforward piece of research, usually problem-free, generally speaking. Very few issues to be addressed. Large-scale study, well, these are more complex to manage. There are budgetary problems for a start because it's large scale. There's monitoring. How well is it doing? Is it meeting the guidelines? Will it end when it said it will end? And what problems are being encountered? And how is the team coordinated? And what's the consistency of approach? And so large scale studies are much more complex. So we have 3 levels of complexity. Early ideas, very simple, straightforward, just thinking about ideas for research and what are the issues associated with particular proposals for research. Small scale study, small team. Large scale, much more complex. Now, structuring the research proposal. Well, the structure will in part depend on whether whether an individual or it's a group research, whether it's individual or group. So the structure will be determined by whether it's individual or whether it's group. So it's important at the start to have very clear ideas about the scale of the research required, what's the research question, and will it involve a large organization or will it be just a small group of people. The steps for the proposal must be agreed in advance to avoid overlap and lack of focus. So it's important right at the outset to have a very clear picture of the process that's going to be undertaken, the various steps, so that it's easy to monitor the progress throughout. It may be wise to see it in the context of a Gantt chart, where each function needs to be completed and there's a sequence of functions and dates for completion, and so it must be organized like that, otherwise it could lead to confusion and the team may start working at cross purpose. Once the hypothesis or hypotheses has been agreed or derived from the literature, then a methodology must be devised to provide the structure for the research. So what exactly is the question that the research is trying to answer? Now that may be cast as a hypothesis. A hypothesis is simply a testable statement, a statement that is amenable to research, normally empirical research, practical research. So determine the hypothesis, determine the question. That's most important. It may be possible to subdivide the methodology into small research categories and merge them later into a total picture. It may be possible in a team to have certain people looking at the research questions and others preparing documents for looking at the total population and trying to determine the total population. Yet another group looking at if sampling is going to be done, how will the sampling be worked out and what literature is available on this. And so it's possible maybe to break up the whole process into smaller sections and later merge them. It depends critically on the nature of the research and the question that is under consideration. In the case of team research, a leader with a clear vision is most important. A team must be led, and the person leading the team must have a very clear vision of what is required and have a clear vision of how to deliver the research. Ideally, the leader should have some past experience in doing this. With individual research, a preliminary table of contents that reflects the required research steps may be useful. In other words, setting out like a table of contents, setting out the various steps that need to be done. So it's like step 1, step 2, step 3, and getting a sequence that way. It's very similar to what I said earlier about a Gantt chart, just setting up in a way that shows each task and a sequence of each task and when the next task can start. But with individual research, it's less complex. So something similar to a table of contents may be used to show the research areas and the sequence in which they will be conducted. Now, the modules in a business research proposal. Well, generally speaking, there's an executive summary. This is mostly used in business research, but increasingly an abstract is being inserted into all formal research papers. So an abstract is like the executive summary. Executive summary is just a page, perhaps, or a page and a half, something short, which gives the essence of what was the research and perhaps what was found, and perhaps a couple of words on the limitations of the research. The problem statement, that should be clear. The research set out to achieve something. It's set out to gain an insight into a certain issue or to solve a particular problem. That should be stated. So that's important. There should be a problem statement. And the research objectives outline the likely benefits that will follow from the research. How will the research benefit the organization? In other words, why should the research take place? What are the advantages of the research? Literature review. Well, the literature is what's happened in the past. It's wise to go back to what's known as the seminal paper. In other words, the first paper that was ever published in this area. So, for example, if the company is looking at the just-in-time system of delivery, just exploring whether it should use that, then go back to the seminal paper on JIT, on the just-in-time system. Just to mention that the researcher has traced through, right from the start to the present day, all of the issues associated with this type of delivery system. So the past research is important. It gives an insight into the issues and makes the researcher aware of issues that need to be confronted and dealt with in the current research. It also can short-circuit a lot of the effort in the current research, because it will indicate what was tried out in the past and what was rejected and why it was rejected in the past, which may be helpful in designing the current research. So a literature review is very important. And a statement about the importance of the study, why it represents good value for money, why it should be funded and why it should take place, and arguments in favour of it, or justifying it to some extent. The research design is also important. Include something on the methodology of the research. How much of the work will be primary research, going to sources directly, and how much of it will be secondary sources, published information, perhaps published by the government or by trade associations. And talk about how data will be collected and what are its limitations, what are the criticisms of the whole data collection procedure. Then look at the data analysis. It depends on what the question is and what the research is about, but it's necessary to look at the amount of data that's required and what statistical technique, if any, is going to be used, or if computers are going to be used for the analysis, or is it just going to be straightforward tabulation and perhaps drawing some graphs or some charts to illustrate the findings. How sophisticated will the results be, or how sophisticated do they need to be? And make sure that the conclusions are drawn directly from the analysis. The conclusions can't be drawn from any place else. The conclusions must be based on the analysis. That's the whole idea of the research. The whole idea of the research is to gain an insight, and the conclusions talk about the insight that was gained. Then produce a list of sources that were used throughout, organize them alphabetically just to make it easy for the reader to find the sources, and index them. Ideally use the Harvard system of referencing, and there are several videos in this module on the Harvard system of referencing. So please look at those and make sure you're up to speed with the Harvard system. The appendices, well, let's have a few words about the appendices. These show certain explanations and calculations that are not strictly necessary in the main body of the report. So if there was complex calculations, putting them into the main body of the report would just clutter up the report, would make it difficult to read, would confuse the arguments and would confuse the points. So put the calculations into the appendices and reference them. Put in many charts or technical terms or technical papers. Definitions and supporting material could go in there as well. Again, you don't want to clutter up the main points. But the appendices should not be too lengthy. There's no hard and fast rule, but some say no more than 10% of the length of the main body of work. But there's no rule really about it. The 10% one is just what some people say. But the appendices should not be very large. They should be quite small and put at the back, numbered and referenced throughout, but not necessarily that big. Now, evaluating the research proposal. Well, first of all, the basics. The report should be well presented with no spelling errors, with good grammar, and no colloquialisms or slang. And technical language, technical issues, they should be explained in the appendices. If there are issues talking about machinery or technical processes or whatever, put them into the appendices and explain them there. But make sure there are no errors in terms of spelling or grammar, and no slang terms, no local terms. It should be in good standard English. Many word processors have got facilities to help with this. They often highlight issues and make recommendations, say bad grammar, recommend the following. Carefully look at this and see if you want to accept the recommendations of the word processor. It should be in a logical form. Later parts have a dependency on the earlier parts, so make sure the early parts come first and the later parts come later. It's logical, it's straightforward. Can I just go back to the basics just for a moment? Just remember, don't mix up, in terms of spelling, don't mix up American spelling and English spelling. Be consistent. So use an S or use a Z, but be consistent throughout. Don't skip between the two. Now, this logical form. Go across the work very carefully and make sure that the sequence is correct. The sequence of ideas are correct. It should have a good table of contents and also an index if the work is very long. Again, word processors generate tables of contents and indices, or an index. It means inserting a little piece of code near the word normally, but then just simply bringing up a command in the word processor will generate the table of contents and the index automatically, which is very clever and very efficient in terms of usage. It should be obvious that it should address the requirements of the research proposal. The work should address what was intended at the start. It should answer the question, or it should give an insight into the problem and make some recommendations as how to solve the problem if that's what the remit was at the start. And emphasize the outcomes, because that's what the research is about. It's trying to find outcomes, it's trying to find solutions, it's trying to find answers, so the outcomes should be emphasized. Right, that's all I'm going to do on this topic. It overlaps with other videos in the module, so go back and look at those and make your own notes and pad out your notes and make sure you have a good set of notes and good understanding of the issues involved in business research. But I'm going to leave it at that for the moment and say thank you for watching.